We're going to have momentarily that expressive capability in PHP, JavaScript, and in Objective-C. Well, what about this one? Let's pick on this P set. So this was from which P set? All right, so 6, right? So this was the spell checking assignment. So this was the spell checking assignment. And here, it was kind of interesting in that we gave you the signature, so to speak, for these various functions, check, load, size, and unload. And then you had to implement them. But here, too, each of these 4 functions was inherently tied to the code base we gave you, such that you could never use or reuse your pset6 code from CS50 without copying and pasting and changing it around, because you didn't make a very generic or reusable piece of software. Rather, you wrote effectively everything in main, and you didn't modularize your code, so that after this class, you could just go and use this as a generic dictionary object for words, for phrases, for any sort of pieces of data, or a hash table more generally. But what this hints at is what we're going to start calling an interface. It turns out with languages like PHP and Objective-C and others, you can specify that this data structure will provide you with the following functionality: X, Y, and Z. And here's what X, Y, and Z return. Here's what they take as arguments. I'm not going to make any claims as to how I implement them underneath the hood, but what we'll find is that structs, or as we'll start calling them classes and objects, can make promises to provide this functionality in a very generic way so that you yourself don't have to keep re-engineering this code. How about just a couple of more glimpses? So this was from later in the semester when we started talking about form validation. So we left C behind, we moved to the browser, we used JavaScript, and we had this crazy, ugly syntax, but effective for validating form submission or invalid inputs. But it was fairly tedious to write, but what it did suggest is that there's some kind of hierarchical relationship among something here called document. And at the time, we described document as some kind of global variable, an object, if you will, which is essentially like a struct, but a little more sophisticated in that objects in JavaScript can have not only member variables, or let's call them properties, but also methods or functions built right into them. And so this said, go into the document object, get the forms object inside of it, get the registration object, email object, and then the value field, which itself was a string. So if you now translate this back to C, this is like having a struct inside of a struct inside of a struct inside of a struct inside of a struct, and finally the leaf of that data structure is a raw string, and in this case the value of that field. So we'll tease apart exactly what these features of this languages are and how we can use them better. Indeed, we can improve upon that significantly by starting to use libraries all the more. So around final project time in 50, we certainly preach the value of APIs and libraries so that you can stand on the shoulders of other people who have written lots of code, who have debugged lots of code, so that you can do more interesting things by leveraging their work. And so this is an example of a very popular library called jQuery, which effectively has become the de facto standard for JavaScript, enough so that people often conflate jQuery with JavaScript, which frankly is fine, because it just means that this has made the language all the more easy to interact with and all the more powerful. Now, even though syntactically it looks a little strange, recall from 50 that $ just means what? So it's just a synonym for an object or a special struct called jQuery. And it turns out that in JavaScript, unlike PHP, the $ can be used, and this is an actual character in a function or in a variable. It doesn't have special meaning. So the author of jQuery just decided, this is nice. It's a single symbol. It kind of looks special. Let me just alias it to this much longer word to type, jQuery. And thus was born this very common convention of saying $, open paren, close paren, and inside of that is just a function's argument. So all this is saying is pass to this global jQuery object, another global object called document, and then start to do some interesting things with that object. .ready actually now refers to a function that's going to get called with this other function. And what did we call these nameless functions in 50? So these are like lambda functions. This is a topic that comes up in CS51 as well, and in other languages besides JavaScript, but it's a wonderfully concise way of defining on the fly a function that you do need once and you do need to exist, but you don't care about giving it a name and polluting your global namespace, so to speak, with lots and lots of functions and variables. Well, lastly here, we had this example where we introduced, albeit with a wave of the hand, these things called exceptions. What are exceptions used for, if you recall, in JavaScript or in other languages? Yeah. Yeah, so they're handling errors, right, in C. And also with a lot of functions in PHP, how do you signify that something bad happened? what do you do normally? If you're a function and you can't give a correct answer because something went wrong, file not found or unreadable, something bad happened, what do you do? So nothing, right? You at least have to return, and if the function has a return type, you have to return some value, and if the function is supposed to return an int, you have to return an int, but the problem that arises in C and in lots of languages is, well, if this function is meant to do math and return a number, well, how am I going to signify an error if 0 might actually be a valid answer, or -1 might actually be an actual answer? Now, PHP redressed this by introducing these things called notices and warnings and errors, which even if you never quite understood why your code was triggering warnings and notices and errors, it did mean something bad was happening, but that was sort of a back channel mechanism for the language to say something bad happened in increasing order of severity, notice to warning to error, the first two of which you can ignore, but your code has some issue. Error means fatal error, can't proceed at all. So that's sort of a back channel mechanism, but it's a little messy, right? Almost everyone in this room probably wrote some PHP code, if you took 50, that triggered one or more of these errors. And so it'd be nice if we could catch them more effectively. And so what these things called exceptions allow you to do is exactly that. Rather than just do something by calling a function, you can instead try to do something, and if anything goes wrong that might otherwise impact the correctness of your program, that function can throw an exception, which is a special object, a special structure that you in your code can catch. So this simple example here in JavaScript proposes to do exactly that. If for some reason this special thing called an XML HTTP request object doesn't exist, well, that function call is going to throw an exception, and if I catch it, I can then conclude that, okay, that didn't work, let me try something else. And in this case, this means if that didn't work, it means you're using Internet Explorer, so we'll try this other mechanism instead. So where else is there now room for improvement? So we introduced jQuery not just for form validation and the like, but also in the context of AJAX. And AJAX is certainly all the rage today. In any dynamic website, from Facebook to Google to any number of others, they're using AJAX underneath the hood. And just as a quick refresher, what does it mean if a website uses AJAX? Sure. We'll just have a nice conversation here today.
They can handle requests without having to refresh the page.
Perfect. It can handle HTTP requests, posts, gets, others, without having to reload the whole page. And this allows you to have a much more seamless interface for users rather than having to reload the whole page. So again, think of your Gmail inbox automatically showing new mail, Facebook status updates automatically appearing, all thanks to AJAX. But notice what's interesting here about jQuery and more specifically JavaScript. There's a whole lot of curly braces here. And that's because fundamental to JavaScript, or quite popular within JavaScript, is the use of objects. And an object, really just a struct, but it can have more things than just variables inside of it or properties. But these structures, these objects induced by open curly brace, close curly brace, allow you to pass around arbitrary collections of key value pairs. And so a very famous computer scientist once said if you could only have one data structure on a desert island, it would be a hash table. And that's because these things are so versatile in that you can store arbitrary combinations of data, keys and values, even hierarchically, simply by giving them names and associated values. And so this is hugely compelling in JavaScript, and we saw this in the context of associative arrays in PHP. Well, now let's pick on pset 7, which in CS50 was CS50 Finance, where you had to implement an E-Trade-like website in HTML and in PHP. So here was a snippet of index.php. And when you were implementing, if you implemented that pset, you might recall writing this code again and again. Or frankly, realistically, you probably did cp index.php space whatever the next file was that you wanted to create. So there was a whole lot of redundancy littered throughout your code. And even if you were wise and you used CSS and you factored everything out into a styles.css file, what we didn't really do or preach in 50 was factoring out even common HTML code. In fact, notice we have head, we have body, we have this top div and a logo, we have close body, close HTML. Those were probably common to every one of your pages for that particular project. And what's the downside of having the same code in multiple files, just to be clear? Yeah?
If you ever change it in one instance and you want to change to propagate, you have to change it in every file.
Yeah, exactly. It's as simple as that. Like, it's just annoying, if nothing else. And it's also prone to errors because if you miss just one thing, either aesthetically or functionally, your site's not going to work as intended. And this is why we introduced .css files and .js files, so we could factor that code out. Wouldn't it be nice if we could start to factor out common template code like this in PHP? And indeed we can. So one of the topics of the course will be design patterns, among them MVC, Model View Controller, which is a common technique for doing exactly that, keeping all of your logic, your so-called business logic, and sort of the core intelligence of your program in separate files altogether, and then relegating all of the aesthetic stuff like CSS and HTML to templates or other sort of standalone files. And the upside of this is not only can you make updates across the board for your application in just one single place, you can also do neat things like support a desktop browser and a mobile browser.